All I know is the weekend before Christmas, the best time to go to the grocery store is at 10 o'clock at night. Just saying. Hey, Fiberista. Man, I'm a bad vlogger again. Yeah, I neglected to post a vlog post yesterday. I guess I just needed a day off. Alright, so today what I'm going to share with you is an answer to another question that I had on the last post that I did on the granny squares. Somebody asked me how I attach those to my blanket. So I'm going to share that with you today. There's probably a gazillion ways that you can connect granny squares to your blanket. This is the way that I like to do it, especially with the kind of granny squares that I'm making with lots of different colors. Alright, so here it is. Alright, Fiberistas, so when I'm selecting an area to attach this granny square, again, I'm looking for an area where I'm not clustering the same colors in the same place. I'm looking for a little contrast and just trying to get an overall balance of colors and the variegation in overall. So when I start out with this crochet, what I'm going to do is again begin to start with the third round of the granny square on this square. But what I'm going to be doing is I'm only going to be doing 3 sides, since I'm going to be attaching that one side to that square. So as you can see, that one side's going to be attached right there. So I'm going to have to do the preliminary 3 rounds of this third row of granny square. What I also like to do is when I'm starting a round, I usually start in the middle of a cluster. That way, for some reason, it gives especially with this kind of blanket, if I can prevent starting the granny square where the 2 clusters join, it's just going to strengthen that the joins of the whole blanket. So again, I just continue as I normally would do with the 3 rounds. And as you can see, in between, on the corners between the clusters, I have 2 stitches. And on the sides between the clusters, I just have 1 stitch. And this is important to note because it's at these areas, the stitches between the clusters, is where I'm going to be attaching this blanket, this square to the rest of the blanket. So like I said, I'm setting up the preliminary 3 sides, because on this square in particular, since it's on the very edge, I'm only going to be attaching that one side to the blanket. Alright, so as you can see, I've finished the preliminary rounds, and since I'm only attaching one side, I'm going to go ahead and do the first stitch and then a single stitch between the clusters, and then use the second stitch to attach it to the blanket. I'm going to go ahead and do the cluster that finishes out that corner, and then where I have that single stitch between the clusters, I'm going to use that single stitch to attach it to the blanket. So I'm going to use it, I'm going to go in between that single stitch down in the blanket below it, and then, you know, finish out the cluster on this round as well. So again, when I get to that single stitch between the clusters, I'm going to use that single stitch to attach it into the corresponding single stitch on the blanket down below, and then can finish out the cluster, do the corner cluster there. So I'm going to do the first 3 stitches of that corner cluster, and then in the 2 stitches between, I'm going to take the first stitch and attach it to the blanket, that single crochet, and then do the second crochet. And remember, I started mid cluster, so I'm going to do that last double crochet to finish out the cluster that I started the round with, and then attach the round. Alright, so as you can see, I have where the single stitches are between the clusters. That's where I'm attaching it down into the single stitches of the clusters down below. So on the next side, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have to, whoop, there we go. So what I'm going to have to do is pre-prep the two sides, because I'm going to be attaching two sides. So I'm just going to pre-prep the two sides that aren't attached to the blanket yet. So again, I like to start mid cluster because that kind of keeps the strength. And you can see that I'm holding the two strands together for the first two stitches of that chain for that first cluster, and that just saves me some time for having to weave in that end. Usually I'll just trim it right off, right close to that cluster, since it's already knotted in. Now this yarn that I'm using is not a merino single. This is actually a three ply yarn, but three plies tend to be not as bubbly and a lot smoother, so it kind of acts like a single ply. So I like using three to four plies as well in this blanket. There's definitely some stash busting in this one. Alright, so I'm coming around to that other edge. So I'm going to start off that cluster, that first cluster, and then do that one stitch. So the second stitch, I'm going to attach it to the blanket on that top corner. Alright, finish out the corner with the second cluster of that corner. Alright, and then in that stitch between the clusters, I'm going to attach it to the blanket. Do the next cluster. Again, the stitch between the clusters, I'm going to attach it to the blanket. Get the corner cluster. Now with the corner cluster, we have two stitches, but we have two squares we're going to be attaching it to. So that first single stitch that you have in between in that corner, I'm going to attach it to the first square right there, the red square. Yep, you can see I attached that one stitch. Alright, and then the second stitch I'm going to attach a crossway into the next side that I'm going to be attaching the square to the blanket with. So one stitch in the first square, the second stitch in the second square, and then I finish out that corner with the second cluster. Again, and then as always, the stitch between the clusters I attach to the blanket. Do the next cluster. Again, the stitch between the clusters I attached to the blanket. The next cluster in that corner, and this is the finishing out that corner. And then that last, the first corner stitch, I'm going to attach it to the blanket, do the second stitch, and then finish out that cluster that I started with. Attach the round. All right, so as you can see where I've, since it's freshly crocheted, you can see where I attached in the spaces in between. All right, so there you have it. There you go. That's the way that I joined my granny squares to my blanket. Thanks for watching, y'all. See you tomorrow.